The sun blazed mercilessly over the endless stretch of cracked earth, where even the hardiest desert plants struggled to survive. Kyle rode his black stallion through the wasteland, his weathered leather armor bearing the crimson markings of his father's tribe. At 28, he carried the weight of leadership on his shoulders, though the official title would not be his until the old war chief drew his final breath. The young warrior had been traveling for 3 days, returning from negotiations with the eastern clans about water rights. His water supply was running low, and his horse showed signs of exhaustion despite its legendary endurance. The meeting had not gone well. The eastern leaders refused to share their precious oasis, claiming his father's tribe had grown too large and consumed too much. As Kyle crested a small hill, something caught his eye in the valley below. A dark figure lay motionless beside what appeared to be the remnants of a broken cart. Vultures circled overhead, their shadows dancing across the barren ground. His first instinct was caution. The wastes were full of traps and bandits who used such scenes to lure travelers. But something about the stillness of the figure made him pause. He guided his horse closer, hand resting on his sword hilt. As the distance closed, he realized it was an elderly woman. Her gray hair spread across the sand, her simple brown dress torn and dusty. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst, and her breathing was so shallow he almost missed it entirely. Kyle dismounted quickly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The woman's cart had clearly broken an axle days ago. Judging by the scattered belongings and the way sand had already begun to claim them. A few pieces of pottery lay shattered nearby, along with what looked like herbal remedies and small cloth bundles. The woman stirred slightly as his shadow fell across her face. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing a startling clarity despite her condition. They were the color of deep amber, and they held a wisdom that seemed far older than her already ancient features. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible. Without hesitation, Kale uncorked his water skin and knelt beside her, supporting her head gently as he helped her drink. She took small, grateful sips, her eyes never leaving his face. After a few moments, she managed to speak more clearly. "You are not from the eastern clans," she observed, her voice still weak but carrying an odd note of certainty. "No, grandmother. I am Kale, son of Warchief Heir of the Crimson Sands tribe." He continued helping her drink, rationing the water carefully between them. The woman's eyes widened slightly. "The Crimson Sands. I knew your grandfather, young one, before the great drought, before the tribe scattered like seeds on the wind." This surprised Kale. His grandfather had died when he was just a child, and few outside the tribe remembered those earlier times. He studied the woman more carefully, noting the intricate silver bangles on her wrists and the quality of her torn dress. She was no common traveler. "What is your name, grandmother? How do you come to be alone in the wastes?" "I am Mira," she said, attempting to sit up. Kyle helped support her, noting how light she felt, as if the desert had already begun to claim her substance. "I was traveling to the city of Ashkar to sell my remedies, but my cart failed me. My grandson was supposed to accompany me, but he fell ill with fever." Kale looked around at the scattered belongings. Among them, he noticed several small glass vials that had survived the cart's destruction, along with bundled herbs he didn't recognize. The woman was clearly some kind of healer or medicine woman. "How long have you been here?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. 3 days, perhaps 4. Time becomes meaningless when death circles overhead. She gestured weakly at the vultures, which had retreated to a respectful distance, but continued their patient vigil. 3 or 4 days without water in this heat should have killed her. The fact that she was still alive, still coherent, spoke to either incredible strength or something else entirely. Kale had seen strong warriors fall in less time. "I cannot leave you here," he said simply, But I must warn you, I have little water left, and my own journey home will take 2 days. Mira's amber eyes studied his face intently. You would risk your own life for a stranger? Your father raised you well. Any decent person would do the same, Kyle replied, though privately he wondered if that were true. Many of his father's warriors would have ridden past without stopping, especially given the tribe's current difficulties. Help me gather what can be saved, Mira said, struggling to her feet. Some of these remedies are worth more than gold in the right hands. Together they collected the unbroken vials and herb bundles, loading them into Kale's saddlebags. The old woman moved slowly but with purpose, and he noticed she seemed to know exactly which items to prioritize. Some of the plants she discarded looked valuable to his untrained eye, while others she treated with reverent care. As they worked, Mira began to tell him about her life. She had once lived in a great city far to the south, where she had served as an advisor to wealthy merchants and even some minor nobles. Her knowledge of herbs and healing had made her reputation, but also her enemies. Jealousy is a poison worse than any I could brew, she explained as she carefully wrapped a particularly delicate vial. Other healers claimed I used dark magic, that my success came from deals with desert spirits. The truth was simpler. I listened to what the plants themselves taught me. Kale found himself fascinated by her stories. His own education had focused on warfare, leadership, and tribal law. The wider world beyond the desert was largely a mystery to him, something glimpsed only through the tales of traveling merchants. Why leave the city for this life? He asked, gesturing at the broken cart and harsh landscape. Mira smiled sadly. Sometimes a person must choose between comfort and truth. The city demanded I keep my knowledge small, serve only those with gold to pay. But healing is like water. It should flow where it is most needed, not where purses are heaviest. As the day wore on, they prepared for the journey ahead. Kale's horse was strong but already tired, and carrying 2 people would slow them significantly. More concerning was their water situation. Even with careful rationing, they might not have enough to reach his tribe's territory. There is another way, Mira said quietly as Kale calculated distances and water reserves. I know of a hidden spring not far from here, but the path is treacherous, and some say it is cursed. Kyle looked at her sharply. Cursed how? Old stories speak of a guardian spirit that protects the water. Those who come with greed in their hearts find only mirages, but those who approach with respect... She shrugged. Perhaps we would find what we seek. The rational part of Kale's mind dismissed such talk as superstition. But he had lived in the desert long enough to know that survival sometimes required trusting in things beyond pure logic. And the alternative, attempting the direct route with insufficient water, seemed equally risky. How far to this spring? He asked. Half a day's journey, but through rocky terrain my cart could never have managed. Your horse is strong enough, though we will need to move carefully. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, they set out. Mira rode behind Kale, her arms wrapped around his waist for support. Despite her age and ordeal, she proved to be an experienced rider, adjusting her balance naturally as they navigated the increasingly difficult terrain. The landscape changed as they traveled, the flat wasteland giving way to a maze of red stone formations and narrow canyons. Mira guided them with quiet confidence, pointing out landmarks that would have been invisible to Kale's untrained eye. Your grandfather came this way once, she said, as they paused to rest in the shade of a towering rock spire. During the worst year of the great drought, when even the deepest wells ran dry. You knew him well? Kyle asked, surprised again by this connection to his family's past. Well enough. He was a man who understood that strength without wisdom leads to ruin. He saved my village from raiders once, asking nothing in return but a meal and a place to rest. As darkness approached, they made camp in a sheltered alcove between two massive boulders. Kyle built a small fire, while Mira prepared a simple meal from supplies she had salvaged. The food was unlike anything he had tasted: simple bread and dried meat, but seasoned with herbs that seemed to restore energy and lift the spirits. Sitting by the flickering flames, surrounded by the vast silence of the desert night, Kale found himself sharing stories of his own life. He spoke of the pressure of being the Warchief's heir, the constant need to prove himself worthy of leadership. He told her about the failed negotiations, the tribe's growing struggles with water and food, the young warriors who questioned whether the old ways could survive in changing times. "Leadership is not about having all the answers," Mira said softly, her face illuminated by the fire's glow. "It is about having the wisdom to seek them and the courage to change course when necessary. My father believes in strength above all else. He says the desert respects only power." "Your father is not wrong. But his vision is incomplete. True strength comes from understanding of your people, your land, and yourself. A leader who rules only through fear will find his reign as brief as a desert storm." As they settled down to sleep, Kyle found his mind churning with new thoughts. This chance encounter with the old woman was already changing his perspective on many things he had taken for granted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope that solutions might exist beyond the narrow path he had been following. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and amber. Kyle woke to find Mira already awake, sitting in quiet meditation as the first rays of sunlight crept into their sheltered alcove. Her weathered hands moved in slow, graceful patterns, and he could hear her whispering what sounded like ancient words in a language he didn't recognize. "Good morning, young Warchief," she said, without opening her eyes. "The spirits of this place have been restless tonight, but they are not hostile. Curious, perhaps." Kyle had slept better than he had in weeks, despite the hard ground and uncertain circumstances. There was something about Mira's presence that brought a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing. As they shared a simple breakfast, she continued to surprise him with her observations. "Your horse is favoring his left rear hoof," she noted, though Kale hadn't noticed any sign of lameness. "Not badly, but the rocky ground is taking its toll. There are plants near the spring that will help." Sure enough, when he examined the stallion's hoof, he found a small stone lodged near the frog. After removing it, he could see the beginning of what might have become a serious problem if left untreated. "How did you know?" he asked. "I have spent many years watching and listening. Animals, like people, speak to those who pay attention. Your horse is strong and loyal, but he trusts you completely. Sometimes that trust can be dangerous if the leader does not see what needs to be seen." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Kale found himself wondering if she was speaking about more than just horsemanship. As they prepared to continue their journey, Mira carefully selected several items from her salvaged supplies. She mixed powders in a small leather pouch, creating what looked like a simple travel remedy but smelled of exotic spices and unfamiliar herbs. "For energy and clear thinking," she explained, offering him a small portion. "The path ahead will test more than our physical endurance." The medicine had an immediate effect, sharpening his senses and clearing the mental fog that had plagued him since the failed negotiations. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct, and he found himself noticing details in the landscape that had been invisible before. They rode deeper into the maze of canyons, following paths that seemed to exist only in Mira's memory. The old woman guided them through passages so narrow that Kale's shoulders nearly brushed the walls and around corners that opened onto breathtaking vistas of stone and sky. "My grandmother brought me here when I was barely 16, Mira explained as they navigated a particularly treacherous stretch. I was arrogant then. Thought I knew everything about healing because I had learned to read the old texts. She wanted to show me the difference between knowledge and wisdom. What did you learn? That the desert is the greatest teacher of all. It strips away everything false, everything unnecessary, until only truth remains. Those who cannot face that truth do not survive. As if summoned by her words, the canyon walls suddenly opened onto a circular chamber carved from living rock. At its center stood a pool of the clearest water Kyle had ever seen, fed by a spring that bubbled up from unknown depths. The water reflected the sky like a perfect mirror, and the air around it shimmered with an almost supernatural clarity. But it was not the spring itself that took Kale's breath away. Around the pool grew plants unlike any he had seen in the desert, lush green ferns, flowering vines, and trees bearing fruit that glowed like jewels in the morning light. The contrast with the harsh wasteland they had just traveled through was so complete, it seemed like entering another world entirely. "The guardian spring," Mira whispered, sliding down from the horse with surprising agility. "Just as I remembered." Kale dismounted more cautiously, his warrior's instincts on alert, despite the peaceful appearance of the place. The silence here was different from the empty quiet of the wasteland. This felt full, pregnant with unseen presence. "Is it safe?" he asked, one hand still resting on his sword hilt. "That depends entirely on us," Mira replied. She walked slowly toward the pool, her movements deliberate and respectful. "The stories say that this place judges the heart of those who find it. The greedy see only mirages. The violent find their weapons turn to dust. But those who come seeking only what they need—" She knelt by the water's edge and cupped her hands, drinking slowly and gratefully. Nothing happened. No supernatural manifestations, no mystical phenomena. Just an old woman drinking clean water in a beautiful hidden place. Emboldened, Kale led his horse to the pool's edge. The stallion drank eagerly, and Kale noticed immediately that the animal's posture straightened, his coat taking on a healthier sheen. When Kale himself tasted the water, it was like drinking liquid light. Not just refreshing, but somehow restorative on a level deeper than mere hydration. "Now I understand," he said quietly. "What do you understand?" "Why my grandfather never spoke of this place. A secret like this. It would draw every desperate soul in the wasteland." Mira smiled approvingly. "Your grandfather was indeed wise. He understood that some gifts are too precious to be shared freely." As they rested by the spring, Mira began to show Kale the plants that grew in this magical oasis. Each one had properties that seemed almost too good to be true. Herbs that could cure fever, roots that restored energy, flowers that eased pain and promoted healing. "Take what you need, but only what you need," she instructed as he marveled at a vine whose leaves shimmered with silver veins. "This place gives freely to those who understand the balance." But Kale found himself thinking not of his own needs, but of his tribe's. The Crimson Sands people had been struggling with a sickness that had taken several of their elders. Their own healers had been unable to find a cure, and morale was beginning to suffer. "There is a plant here," Mira said as if reading his thoughts, "that might help your people, but harvesting it requires knowledge, patience, and respect. Take too much, or take it wrongly, and it becomes poison instead of medicine." She showed him a delicate flowering bush with roots that grew in complex spirals around the spring's edge. The flowers were tiny, almost insignificant, but they pulsed with a faint inner light. "Moonbell," she explained. "One of the rarest healing plants in the world. A single flower, properly prepared, can cure the wasting sickness that has been plaguing desert communities for years." Kale's heart raced. The wasting sickness. That was exactly what had been affecting his tribe. But as he reached toward the plant, Mira caught his hand. Not yet. First, you must understand. This is not just about taking something valuable back to your people. The real healing begins with changing how you think about problems. Over the next several hours, as the sun climbed high overhead, Mira began teaching Kale things his warrior training had never covered. She showed him how to read the subtle signs that indicated a plant's readiness for harvest, how to gather materials without damaging the source, how to prepare medicines that worked with the body's natural healing rather than against it. But more than practical knowledge, she taught him about patience, observation, and respect for the natural world. Everything in the oasis existed in delicate balance, each plant and creature playing a vital role in maintaining the whole. Your tribe's real problem is not the sickness itself, she explained as they worked together to prepare a small amount of moonbell extract. It is the imbalance that allowed the sickness to take hold. Healing the symptoms without addressing the cause will only delay the inevitable return of the problem. What kind of imbalance? Think about your people's way of life. How have they changed in recent years? What old practices have been abandoned? What new stresses have been introduced? Kyle considered this carefully. His father's leadership had indeed brought changes. More aggressive expansion, harder training for warriors, less time devoted to traditional ceremonies and seasonal observances. The tribe had grown stronger militarily, but perhaps at the cost of other kinds of strength. My father believes the old ways make us weak, he said slowly. And what do you believe? It was a question that struck at the heart of his internal conflicts. I used to think he was right, but spending time here talking with you, I'm beginning to think maybe strength comes in more forms than we've been considering. As the afternoon wore on, they gathered other supplies, water for the journey ahead, healing herbs for Kale's horse, and several varieties of plants that Mira said would be valuable for trade or medicine. But they took only small amounts, leaving the oasis largely undisturbed. Now comes the real test, Mira said as they prepared to leave. Can you carry this knowledge back to your people without letting it become just another source of power and wealth? It was a profound question. The spring's location alone would be incredibly valuable information. Control over its resources could shift the balance of power among the desert tribes. But Kale was beginning to understand that such thinking might destroy the very thing that made the place valuable. I think, he said carefully, that the most important thing I'm taking back is not any plant or medicine, but a new way of seeing problems. Mira's amber eyes sparkled with approval. Now you begin to understand why I chose to leave my comfortable life in the city. Real healing of people, of communities, of the land itself, requires wisdom that cannot be bought or sold. As they prepared to leave the oasis, Kale realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of leadership. The failed negotiations that had seemed like such a disaster just days before now appeared in a different light. Perhaps the Eastern clan's refusal to share their water was itself a symptom of the same kind of thinking that had been limiting his own tribe. When we reach my people, he said as they mounted his horse for the journey home, would you be willing to stay with us, at least for a while? I think your knowledge could help us in ways that go far beyond medicine. I will stay as long as I am needed, Mira replied. But remember, true healing always begins from within. I can show you new paths, but you and your people must choose to walk them. As they rode away from the hidden spring, Kyle felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. The weight of leadership was still there, but it felt different now, less like a burden and more like an opportunity to serve something greater than himself. The journey back to tribal lands would give them time to plan, to discuss the changes that might be possible, and to prepare for what would certainly be resistance from those who profited from the current way of doing things. But for the first time in months, Kale felt genuinely optimistic about the future. Neither of them spoke much as they traveled, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with shared understanding and mutual respect. The old woman who had seemed destined to die alone in the wasteland had become something far more valuable than he could have imagined. A teacher, a guide, and perhaps most importantly, a friend whose wisdom could help transform not just his own life, but the lives of his entire people. The sight of the Crimson Sands encampment rising from the desert haze filled Cale with complex emotions. The familiar red banners snapping in the wind, the neat rows of leather tents, the sound of children playing and warriors training. It was home, but he was no longer the same person who had left just days before. Word of their approach had already spread through the camp. Warriors emerged from their duties to watch the Warchief's son return with an unknown elderly woman riding behind him. Cale could see the questions in their faces, the mixture of curiosity and suspicion that greeted any stranger in these difficult times. Theron, the aging Warchief, waited outside his tent with several of his most trusted advisors. At 63, he remained a formidable presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and scars that told the story of countless battles. His dark eyes took in every detail of his son's appearance, noting the changes that even a few days could bring. "You return earlier than expected," Theron said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded the tribe for over 2 decades. "And with a guest." Kyle dismounted and helped Mira down with the same careful respect he had shown since finding her in the wasteland. Several of the younger warriors exchanged glances. Their future leader was acting more like a servant than a prince. "Father, this is Mira, a healer of great knowledge. I found her dying in the desert and could not leave her there." Theron's expression remained neutral, but Kyle caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested displeasure. In the current climate of scarce resources, taking in refugees was seen as weakness by many in the tribe. "A noble gesture," the war chief said diplomatically. "But tell me of the negotiations. What news from the eastern clans?" This was the moment Cale had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The old him would have delivered the news of failure with shame and anger, perhaps even recommending military action to take by force what could not be gained through diplomacy. "They refused our request for water access," he began, noting how several advisors immediately began muttering about the need for stronger measures. "But I believe there may be other solutions to our people's needs." "Other solutions?" This came from Gareth, the war chief and Theron's oldest friend. "The eastern clans grow fat while our children thirst. What other solution is there besides making them share?" Kyle glanced at Mira, who had remained silent during the exchange, but whose presence seemed to radiate calm wisdom. "I have learned much during this journey. Perhaps it would be better to discuss these matters in council, where all may hear and contribute their thoughts." Theron raised an eyebrow. His son had never before requested a full council meeting to discuss failed negotiations. Typically, such failures were handled with swift military planning and decisive action. "Very well," the war chief decided. "We will convene the council at sunset. But first, see that your guest is given food and shelter, and have the healers examine you both. The desert sun can affect a man's judgment." As the crowd dispersed, Cale led Mira toward the section of the camp reserved for honored guests and visiting dignitaries. But she touched his arm gently, stopping him. "Perhaps it would be better if I stayed with the healers," she suggested quietly. "I can be more useful there, and it will cause less controversy among those who already question your decision to bring me here." It was wise counsel, and Cale realized that Mira had already assessed the political undercurrents in the camp far better than he had. Her status as a stranger and a woman would make some people automatically suspicious of her influence. The tribe's chief healer, an elderly man named Jorik, welcomed Mira with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism. He had been struggling with the wasting sickness for months, losing several patients despite his best efforts. When Mira quietly offered to share some of her knowledge, his pride initially bristled at the suggestion that an outsider might succeed where he had failed. But within hours, word began to spread through the camp of remarkable recoveries. A young warrior whose fever had broken the spirits of 3 different healers was sitting up and asking for food. An elderly woman who had been bedridden for weeks was walking unassisted. Children who had been listless and weak were playing games again. By the time the council convened that evening, the entire atmosphere in the camp had shifted. The mysterious old woman was no longer seen as just another mouth to feed, but as someone with valuable gifts to offer. The council meeting took place in the largest tent, with representatives from every major family group and profession within the tribe. Theron sat in the place of honor, with his advisors arranged around him in order of importance. Kyle took his customary position at his father's right hand, but for the first time he felt the weight of all those eyes as an opportunity rather than a burden. "My son has requested this gathering to discuss alternatives to our current difficulties," Theron began. "Speak, and let all hear your words." Kale rose slowly, his mind clear and focused in a way it had not been for months. The moonbell extract Mira had prepared seemed to have sharpened not just his physical senses, but his ability to think and communicate. "Brothers and sisters of the Crimson Sands," he began, using an address that was more formal and inclusive than his usual speaking style. "I went to the Eastern clans believing our only choice was to take from others what we needed for ourselves. I return with the understanding that true strength comes not from taking, but from growing." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd. This was not the kind of language they expected from their future war leader. "The Eastern clans refused to share their water," Kale continued, "and perhaps they were right to do so. We came to them as strangers seeking favors, offering nothing but threats in return. We have been thinking like raiders when we should be thinking like builders." Gareth leaned forward, his weathered face showing displeasure. "Soft words will not fill our water barrels, young prince. If they will not share willingly, we must take what we need by force." "And after we take their water by force," Kale replied calmly, "what then? Do we station warriors there permanently to hold what we have stolen? Do we fight them again when they inevitably try to reclaim what was theirs? How much blood will we spill for water that could run dry tomorrow?" "Then what do you propose?" This came from Arya, one of the few women who held a seat on the council by virtue of her role as trade coordinator. "We cannot survive much longer on our current resources. I propose we stop thinking about water as something to be fought over, and start thinking about it as something to be found." Kyle gestured toward the tent entrance, where the sounds of the rejuvenated camp could be heard. "The healer Mira has knowledge of hidden springs, of ways to find water that others have missed. But more than that, she understands how to help communities heal themselves from within." An older council member named Darius spoke up with obvious skepticism. "You would have us trust our survival to the folktales of a wandering woman? What proof do we have that these supposed hidden springs even exist?" It was a fair question, and one that Kale had expected. He reached into his travel pack and withdrew one of the vials of pure spring water he had collected from the oasis. The liquid seemed to glow with inner light in the flickering torchlight. "I have seen such a spring with my own eyes," he said simply. "But that is not the point. The point is that we have been so focused on competing with our neighbors that we have forgotten to explore the possibilities within our own reach." He paused, letting his eyes move across the faces of the council members. "How long has it been since we sent scouts to map the deep desert? How long since we investigated the old stories of hidden water sources? How long since we asked ourselves whether there might be better ways to survive in this land than taking from others by force? Theron had been listening in thoughtful silence, but now he leaned forward. You speak of hidden springs and ancient wisdom as if they were reliable solutions, but we are responsible for the lives of 300 people. We cannot base their survival on possibilities and legends. Then let us test these possibilities, Kale replied. Give me a small group of volunteers. Let me spend 1 month exploring the southern reaches that have been unmapped for generations. If we find nothing, we will know that the old ways are indeed our only choice. But if we discover new sources of water, new ways of living in harmony with the desert instead of fighting against it. The tent fell silent as the implications sank in. What Kale was proposing was a fundamental shift in how the tribe approached survival, from a mentality of conquest to one of exploration and adaptation. And what of the eastern clans? Gareth asked. Do we simply ignore their insults? Do we let them think the Crimson Sands have grown weak? We show them something better than strength, Kale answered. We show them wisdom. When we have found new sources of water, when our people are thriving instead of merely surviving, we can approach them not as supplicants or enemies, but as equals with something valuable to offer in trade. The debate continued for hours, with voices raised on both sides of the proposal. The older warriors favored the traditional approach of taking what they needed by force. Many of the younger members were intrigued by Kale's vision of a different path. The crafters and traders who understood the value of sustainable relationships found themselves cautiously supportive. In the end, it was Mira herself who tipped the balance. Jorik, the chief healer, had asked her to address the council about the medical techniques she had shared. When she rose to speak, her voice carried a quiet authority that commanded attention. I have seen many tribes and many cities, she said simply. Those that survive and prosper are not necessarily the strongest in battle, but those that adapt best to change. The desert is changing. The climate, the water sources, the relationships between peoples, all of it is in flux. Those who cling too tightly to old ways will find themselves left behind by history. She paused, her amber eyes reflecting the torchlight. But those who have the courage to seek new paths, to learn and grow and change, they will not merely survive, they will thrive. When the vote was finally taken, it was closer than Kale had hoped, but decisive enough to carry forward. He would be given 1 month and 20 volunteers to explore the southern desert and test his theories about hidden water sources and alternative survival strategies. Over the following weeks, the expedition's preparations became a kind of celebration in itself. The entire tribe seemed energized by the possibility of a different future. Mira worked closely with the volunteers, sharing her knowledge of desert survival, water location, and the subtle signs that indicated the presence of hidden springs. But perhaps more importantly, she worked with Kale himself, helping him develop the leadership skills he would need for this new kind of challenge. Traditional warrior leadership was about commanding obedience through strength and fear. What he was attempting would require inspiring cooperation through vision and wisdom. A leader who forces people to follow him will find himself walking alone when the path becomes difficult, she taught him during their evening discussions. A leader who shows people a path worth walking will find himself surrounded by companions eager to face any challenge. The expedition departed on a morning when the desert air was crisp and clear, filled with the kind of promise that comes with new beginnings. Kale led the group southward into territory that had been unexplored for decades, following not only Mira's guidance, but also his own growing intuition about reading the landscape. What they discovered over the following month exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. 3 new spring sites, 2 previously unknown oases, and a network of seasonal streams that could support small permanent settlements. But more than water, they found something else, a new confidence in their ability to thrive rather than merely survive. When they returned to the main camp, They brought with them not just maps and water samples, but stories of cooperation, innovation, and discovery that rekindled the tribe's sense of purpose and possibility. The impact on both Kale and Mira was equally transformative. Kale had evolved from a warrior prince focused on proving his worthiness through strength into a leader who understood that true power came from helping others realize their potential. The failed negotiations that had seemed like such a disaster had become the catalyst for the most significant positive change in his tribe's recent history. For Mira, the experience had given her something she had not realized she was seeking: a true home and family. No longer the wandering healer surviving on the edges of civilization, she had become an honored elder whose wisdom helped guide an entire community toward a brighter future. Years later, when other tribes spoke of the Crimson Sands people, they would tell stories not of their fierceness in battle but of their wisdom in finding abundance where others saw only scarcity. They would speak of the young war chief who chose exploration over conquest, and of the wise woman whose simple act of kindness had changed the course of history. And sometimes, in quiet moments around evening fires, Kale and Mira would remember that day in the wasteland when two lives had intersected by chance, each saving the other in ways that neither could have imagined at the time. What had begun as a simple act of human decency had blossomed into something far greater, a transformation that touched not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. The hidden spring in the desert had been real, but the true miracle had been the spring of wisdom and compassion that their friendship had released into the world, creating abundance where there had been scarcity, hope where there had been despair, and community where there had been isolation. In the end, both had found something more valuable than water in the wasteland. They had found purpose, belonging, and the deep satisfaction that comes from using one's gifts in service of something greater than oneself.